Of God, we want to continue the previous session discussion about the second concept, which is the if natural language is primarily a genetic entity, semantic or the lexicon cannot be part of the core of linguistics. Meanings can constitute the variable contextual, cultural aspects of language per excellence. Because social interaction, the exchange of ideas and changing conceptions of the world are primarily mediated through the meaning of the linguistic expression, it is unlikely that the universal aspects of language will be found in the realm of meaning. Further, if the lexicon is the main repository of linguistically encoded meaning, studying the lexicon is of secondary importance. Here, as before, though it should be pointed out that the actual historical development is less straightforward than the reconstruction might suggest. The desemantization of the grammar didn't happen at once. Triggered by the introduction of meaning in the standard model of generative grammar by Chomsky in 1965, the linguistic wars of the late 1960s that opposed generative semantic and interpretive semantic basically involved the demarcation of grammar with regard to semantic. The answer that Chomsky ultimately favored implied a restrictive stance with regard to the introduction of meaning into the grammar, but this position was certainly not reached in one step. It was prepared by severe debates in the generativist community. Please read this concept, they are important, and I just read them. The third one is, if semantics or the lexicon cannot be part of the core of linguistics will focus on formal rule systems. The preference for formal syntax that characterizes generative grammar follows by elimination from its genetic orientation. Formality is required to keep out meaning, and studying syntax, or more generally the rule-based aspects of language, correlates with the diminished interest in the lexicon. It should be added that the focus on rules is not only determined by a negative attitude with regard to meaning, but also by a focus on the infinity of language. Language as an infinite set of sentences requires a rule system that can generate an infinity of sentences. Finally, if linguistics focuses on formal rule systems, the application of the rule systems in actual usage is relatively uninteresting. If the rules define the grammar, it is hard to see what added value could be derived from studying the way in which the rules are actually put to use. The study of performance, in other words, is just as secondary as research into the lexicon. This chain of consequences, please, this paragraph are important, and you should know their concept and you should summarize them because they are important. This chain of consequences lead to the contextualization of the grammar. It embodies a restrictive strategy that separates the autonomous grammatical module from different form of context, without further consideration of the interrelationship between the various aspects of the contextualizing drift. The main effect can be summarized as follows. Through the basic Chomskyan shift from Ling to competence, Linguistics is separated from the social context of language as a social code. Through the focus on the genetic aspects of the language, linguistics is separated from the cognitive contexts that show up in the semantic side of language. Through the focus on formal rule system, linguistics is separated from the situational context of actual language. I want to repeat these three matters. They are important. That through the basic Chomsky shift from the line to competence, linguistics is separated from the social context of language as a social code. Through the focus on the genetic aspects of the language, linguistics is separated from the cognitive context that shows up in the semantic side of the language. Through the focus on formal rule systems, linguistics is separated from the situational context of actual language use. In terms of sub-disciplines covered by linguistics, this means that the core of linguistics in Chomsky terms respectively excludes sociolinguistics, semantic and the lexicon, and pragmatics. This is important. I want to repeat it again. In terms of sub-disciplines covered by linguistics, this means that the core of linguistics in Chomsky terms respectively excludes sociolinguistics, semantic and the lexicon, and pragmatics. This does not mean, however, that these disciplines, which would be considered peripheral from the generative point of view, disappeared altogether. In fact, the generativist era witnessed the birth in the 1960s and 1970s of approaches that autonomously developed the aspects that were rejected or downplayed by generative grammar. Sociolinguistics, including the sociology of language, ethnography of speaking, and socio-historical linguistics, next to sociolinguistics in the narrow Lebevian sense, pragmatic, including discourse linguistics and conversational analysis, and formal semantic. None of the approaches mentioned here, however, overcomes the autonomist restrictions in any fundamental sense. Sociolinguistics and pragmatics exist alongside grammatical theory rather than interacting with it intensively, and the conception of meaning that lies at the basis of formal semantics is too restricted to consider it a truly contextualized grammar. In other words, the recuperation of the contextual aspects rejected by generative grammar could go further, and this is exactly what is happening in a number of contemporary trends in linguistics. From roughly 1985 onwards, in fact, a number of trends in linguistics appear to link the grammar more closely to the contextual aspects that were severed from it by generative theorizing. The peripheral aspects that were being developed largely separately and autonomously are now being linked up more narrowly with the grammar itself, which can then no longer be autonomous. When we have a look at the relevant developments, we will see that cognitive linguistics play a role in each of them. First, the reintroduction of the lexicon into the grammar is probably the most widespread of the tendencies to be mentioned here. It is in fact relatively clear within generative grammar itself. This lexicalized tendency in grammatical theory is triggered by the recognition that describing grammatical rules appear to imply description, describing the lexical set that the rule applies to. Reversing the descriptive perspective then leads to a description of the valence of the lexical item. The lexicalist tendency appears in various forms in the more formal approaches to grammar. One may think of the projection and the theta rules of generative grammar, of the central rule of the lexicon in lexicon functional grammar, and the lexically driven grammar developed in the framework of head-driven phrase structure grammar. In the context of cognitive linguistics, the relexification of the grammar is most outspoken in construction grammar, which starts from the recognition that there is a continuum between syntax and lexicon. Construction are syntactic structures that may contain lexical material. Second, cognitive linguistics at large is the most outspoken current attempts to give meaning a central position in the architecture of the grammar, in contrast with formal semantics. However, the conception of meaning that lies at the basis of this approach is not restricted to the referential, truth-functional type of meaning. Linguistic structures are sought to express conceptualization. That is, conceptualization is central for linguistic structure, and conceptualization goes further than mere reference. It involves imagery in the broadest sense of the word, ways of making sense, of imposing meaning. Also, the conceptualizations that are expressed in the language have an experiential basis, that is, they link up with the way in which human beings experience reality, both culturally and psychologically and physiologically. In this sense, cognitive linguistics embodies a fully contextualized conception of meaning. Again, there are other approaches that develop a meaning-based approach to grammar, like Hallidayan systematic functional grammar, but cognitive linguistics is undoubtedly the most outspoken example of this tendency. And third, the link between linguistic performance and grammar is reestablished by those functionalist approaches that try to find potentially universal discourse motivation for grammar or grammatical constructs. Discourse is then no longer the mere application of grammatical rules, but the grammatical rules themselves are motivated by the discourse functions that the grammar has to fulfill. The existence of passive in a given language, for instance, is then explained as a topicalization mechanism. Grammars contain passives because topicalizing direct objects in a useful function in discourse. Seminal publications within this approach include Gibbon, Hopper, and Thompson. Hopper. These names are not important. Okay, I think it is enough until this matter and this person are not important. This line are not important, and there isn't need to know them. Okay, to conclude, if we can agree that contemporary linguistics embodies a tendency or a cluster of tendencies, to be more precise, toward the contextualization of the linguistic inquiry, we may also agree that cognitive linguistics embodies this trend to an extent that probably no other theoretical movement does. It embodies the resemanticization of grammar by focusing on the interplay between language and conceptualization. It embodies the recovery of the lexicon as a relevant structural level by developing network models of grammatical structure like construction grammar. And it embodies the discursive turn of contemporary linguistics by insisting explicitly on the usage-based nature of linguistics. Other approaches may develop each of these tendencies separately in more detail than cognitive linguistics does, but it is the latter movement that combines them most explicitly and so epitomizes the characteristics underlying drift and drive of present-day linguistics. We would like to suggest, in short, that it is this feature that constitute one of the fundamental reasons behind the success of cognitive linguistics. I think this booklet is enough until this matter, and the future of cognitive linguistics is not important. Please look at these lines, which I explained them for you, and they are important. You should know their concept and you should summarize them. Through this PowerPoint, which I get it from internet, it is not I don't make this PowerPoint. When I was searching for the cognitive approach, I find this PowerPoint, and I think this PowerPoint gives us some concept of cognitive linguistics, and it can help us to be more familiar with this approach. At first, a slide is not important, but here okay. The cognitive approach, its basic assumptions. You should know these key points. The cognitive approach focuses on how people perceive, store, manipulate, and interpret information. This PowerPoint is very important because it gives us some point and some key terms about cognitive approach, and you should know all of them. Therefore, the cognitive approach focuses on how people perceive, store, and manipulate and interpret information. Cognitive psychologists look at internal mental processes to understand behavior. Cognitive psychologists look at internal mental processes to understand behavior. Thought processes can and should be studied scientifically. Well-controlled laboratory studies can investigate what are thinking. Mental processes are private and cannot be observed. Mental processes are private and cannot be observed. Cognitive psychologists study them indirectly by making inferences about what is going on inside people's head. Okay, they believe that the mental processes are not observable, and the cognitive psychologists to access these mental processes use the inferences about what is going inside the people's head. But what we mean by inference and inferring? What does it mean to infer something? The process whereby cognitive psychologists draw conclusions about the way mental processes operate on the basis of observed behavior. Based on the observed behavior, they conclude about the mental processes. This is the meaning of inferring. You should know that. You should be able to define inference. Making a logical conclusion on the basis of evidence and reasoning. Here we have two definitions for inference or inferring. Making a logical conclusion on the basis of evidence and reasoning, and even based on the observed behavior, we can find the operation of mental processes. This is the meaning of inference. Inference or inferring, for finding that, we can do this matter, which this slide is not important. Just its definition is important. Key aspects of cognitive approach. Key aspects of cognitive approach. The rule of schemas. The schemas are important in cognitive approach. The role of theoretical and computer models. The emergence of cognitive neuroscience. Okay. Three key aspects of cognitive approach are rule of schemas, rule of theoretical and computer models, and the emergence of cognitive neuroscience. Okay. About the schemas. What we mean by schemas? A package of beliefs and expectation on a topic that come from prior experience. You should be able to define schemas. What we mean by schemas in cognitive linguistics. By schemas we mean a package of beliefs and expectations. A package of beliefs and expectations on a topic that come from prior experience. They are useful by helping us to take shortcuts in thinking, born with basic ones, then develop from experience, but can lead to faculty conclusion and unhelpful behavior. Okay. Again about schemas. Here it gives us some word and want us to find their schemas through the cognitive linguistics. They are not important. Schemas, which was the packages of ideas developed through our experiences. Here again in this slide, explain about the schema, which is packages of ideas developed through our experiences. They are a mental framework that speeds up the processing of incoming information, like something that has 4 legs and a seat can be sat on and is called a chair. In this way, we have a schema. As we get older and experience more, our schemas become more delayed and sophisticated. As babies, we only know how to grasp and cycle. A schema, you should know this, they are important. You should know all of this matter about the schema. A schema enables us to process lots of information quickly. The advantages of a schema. A schema enables us to process lots of information quickly. They stop us being overwhelmed by environmental stimuli. They can distort our interpretation. They can lead to judgmental, bias, or irrational thinking. You should know that. This is important. The rule of schemas. 2 groups of participants were shown a sequence of pictures, either a number of different faces or a number of different animals. They were then shown the ambiguous figure, the rat man, here below. Participants who saw a sequence of faces were more likely to perceive the figure as a man, this figure, whereas participants who saw a sequence of animals were more likely to perceive the figure as a rat. It means that their experience affect on their schema. Theoretical models. These are simplified representations based on current research evidence, usually around 1960s to 1980s. They are often in picture form represented by boxed and arrows that represent flow direction and stages. Here you can see them. These models help psychologists to be able to understand mental processes without actually seeing them. First we have the environmental stimulus, then it goes to the sensory memory, then we have attention, and we have a short-term memory, which our information goes to this part. Then we have here in that time momentary we have information retrieval, and some information goes to the long-term memory. The role of computer models, which is common in cognitive linguistics. The development of computers and computer programming led to a focus on the way that sensory information is passed through the system. Using a computer analogy, information is passed through the senses, encoded into memory, and then combined with previously stored information to complete the task. First we have input, which is sometimes the sensory information, then we process them, and then we have output like the computer models. Information processing model. First we have input, processing, and output, analogically with the computer processing and computer work. First we have input, processing, and output. We get our input from the environment via the senses. Through our 5 senses we get information from the environment, then we process them. The information is encoded and processed using schema. Then after the processing in our brain we have output, which is observable behavior. Our input can be here your dog bark outside at the night and see a firework. Here we have an example of this process. For example, you hear your dog bark outside at night and see a firework. And then you get this input and you process that. Remember that dogs can be scared of fireworks, and infer that the dog saw the firework. And after the processing, our output is bring the dog into the house. It is an example. Or another example is our input is do badly in a test. Our process, recall that you didn't do any revision and went out with the friends the night before. Then our output is that the result of our test is affected by this matter. And here it gives us some other example which want us to fill this blank. Which this is not important, I don't want that. One of the key concepts of cognitive linguistics was cognitive neuroscience. In the last 25 years, 1995 onward, advances in the technology have allowed us to study the brain scientifically and actually look at the internal neurological basis of mental processes. Cognitive neuroscience is the scientific study of the influence of brain structure, neuro, and mental processes, which is cognition. Cognitive neuroscience is, you should know the definition of cognitive neuroscience, which is the scientific study of the influence of brain structure, nerve, on the mental process, which is cognition. Which here you can see the PET or CT scan is one of the tools to find the process of the brain. Here it's another figure which show our brain through the neuroimaging tools, which is the brain of normal person. It is the mild cognitive impairment and is Alzheimer's disease. Cognitive neuroscience, some of the things that psychologists have learned from cognitive neuroscience. The different locations of episodic and semantic memory, right and left prefrontal cortex, the location of the language centers in the brain, Broca and Wernicke areas, a link between OCD and the parahippocampal gyrus. Highly controlled lab experiment used to make inferences. It has produced reliable and objective data, the neuroimaging tools. Also, the emergence of cognitive neuroscience has enabled two fields, cognitive and biological, to work together and establish a scientific basis. Application to real life of cognitive neurosciences. That cognitive psychology has been applied to many real world fields like artificial intelligence, development of machines that can think, or robots, like the treatment of depression through correcting negative thought patterns, eyewitness testimony in court. Less deterministic. It is founded on self-determinism. This means that we are free to think about the stimulus, but we can only operate on what we know from the environment. Matching reductionism. As the human mind is linked to a computer, it ignores human motivation and emotions. Research has shown that emotion, like anxiety and fear, does impact how well we process the information. This is not considered in the cognitive approach, unfortunately. Problem with lab experiments. Much of the research in the cognitive psychology comes from lab experiments. The stimuli used to test mental processing, like word lists, lack mundane realism and or artificial. This means that approach lack external validity. Until the 26 slides is important, and after that other slides are not important. I don't want them. Here through this session, this last session, we explained the cognitive linguistics, which is one of the linguistic schools. And in these two sessions, I explained the one chapter of the handbook, so that I try to introduce the cognitive approach principle and its important persons. And I want you to look at those matters which I focus on them, which I consider them as important matters, and I will ask you about this concept. For example, when I define some terms, I want you to know them for a final exam. For example, in the PowerPoint, I defined the schema. I want the definition of a schema. I want the cognitive approach, its principle, its assumption. I want you to be able to define the inference or inferring. You should know that in cognitive linguistics we are affected by computer modeling, and we use the computer modeling in cognitive linguistics. We have a schema, which our schemas come from our prior experience, and or schemas in or the mind of different people is different. Here in this slide it wants you to express your schemas about this matter. We read about the advantages of a schema and its disadvantages. Here it in this slide told us about the effect of experiences on the schema. These two participants with different experiences answered differently to the question, and even through the in cognitive linguistics, through the observable data, we try to find the mental processes, which that was the inference. And another matter was cognitive neuroscience, which here through the neuro-linguistic images, we try to find the processing of the brain. We try to observe its functions through these neuroimaging tools, and through this cognitive neuroscience we find these matters. You should know that. And even about another concept, another key terms in cognitive linguistics. As I told you, just you should look at this slide until 26 slides, and other are not important, and just ask some questions. Dear student, you should be able to introduce, for example, the cognitive linguistics. You should know its principle, its state, its important persons, its differences with, for example, generative grammar, which I discussed in this chapter, and even you should know the key concepts of cognitive linguistics. Please look at the movie, look at this video. So sorry, sometimes you need to look at this video many times to get the points. And even I want you to read the booklet by yourself. Sometimes I forget and I overlook some terms, that terms can make clear some points for you, and I want you to read this booklet by yourself, and after that you can look at the video again to get the point. Please summarize the important point in this session, and please look at the terms, their definition, and the key concepts for a fun exam, because I will ask you about these matters, and as your final exam is as multiple choice, and I give you 4 items for each question, you should look at these lines you should pay attention to all of these lines, all of the terms, because they are important. Maybe I put them in a slot and I want you to fill them with, for example, the correct terms, or sometimes I give you the term and I want you to define it in the correct way. Therefore, you should know the terms, their definition, and the key concept of each session. They are important, and even you should summarize the important point for your summarization task. And for your final exam, you should read all of the matters which I focus on them. You should know them because they are important, and I can ask you about all of this matter which I focus on them. Therefore, look at the video of all of these sessions, summarize them, and ask me your question. If some matters and some concepts are not clear for you, ask me and I try to clear them for you. And please overlook those and ignore those matters which I don't focus on them. The details are not important. All of the details which I don't focus on them are not important.